He thought it was just another catch, one more haul from the fog-covered coast of Maine. But when his net broke the surface, it carried something no one could name, a fish that refused to decay, eyes that never clouded, flesh that corroded salt and darkened water. Scientists begged him not to eat it, not to burn it, not to return it to the sea. And yet, hidden in his kitchen, he kept a peace no one else knew about. What secret did the ocean give him? And what price would the world pay if he chose wrong? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sea was quiet that morning, its surface broken only by the rolling swell and the hiss of waves brushing against the hull of the old wooden boat. Fog lay heavy across the water, a pale wall that blurred the horizon and muffled sound, so that even the call of gulls seemed distant and uncertain. The fisherman moved in silence, his hands practiced, pulling at the nets with the rhythm of a man who had done this more times than he could count. Salt clung to his coat, damp from the spray, and his breath clouded in the cold air as he worked. It was a kind of morning where nothing seemed out of place, where routine carried him forward without thought. But the weight of the net felt different. Not the steady resistance of cod or the frantic thrash of mackerel, but something uneven, shifting, as though the sea itself resisted being lifted. He braced his feet against the planks, tugged harder, and the ropes creaked with strain. The first glimpse came slowly through the weave of the net, flashes of light catching beneath the water. At first he thought it was only the reflection of dawn filtered through the fog, but as the shape rose higher, the colors grew sharper, iridescent, shifting in ways the sea should not produce. He pulled it over the side, and it landed on the deck with a heavy, wet thud. The fisherman stepped back, breath caught in his throat. It was a fish, and yet not like any he had seen in decades of working these waters. Its body was long, scaled in plates that shimmered with hues of violet, green, and deep cobalt, each shift and angle sending another cascade of unnatural light across its skin. The head was broad, its eyes large and glass-like, reflecting the fog as though holding a mirror inside. Its fins were not quite right, jagged in form, edged with translucent filaments that glowed faintly even in the gray morning. For a long moment, he did not move. The fish's gills fluttered once, then stilled, as if it had exhausted its final breath the moment it touched the deck. The smell was not the usual brine and sharpness of sea catch, but something faintly metallic, like iron dragged through salt water. The fisherman crouched slowly, careful not to touch it, and studied the details. The scales felt thicker than they should be, armor-like, and its mouth was lined not with rows of teeth, but something more like ridge plates, worn smooth yet unnatural. He reached out, hesitated, then drew back. He had handled sharks, rays, and deep-water oddities brought by accident, but nothing carried the same unease. The longer he looked, the more he felt that the fish did not belong here, not in these waters, not in this time. The fog pressed close around the boat, muting the world, leaving only him, the silent sea, and the shimmering body at his feet. Practicality finally forced him to act. He fetched the tarp from the stern and wrapped the creature carefully, binding it with rope to keep it from sliding on the wet planks. The boat rocked gently, and every motion seemed to send the wrapped fish into a faint glow, like embers beneath cloth. He avoided looking at it directly, focusing instead on the simple task that had always guided his mornings: stowing nets, adjusting the tiller, checking the lines. Yet the presence of the catch weighed on him more than its actual size, a pressure at the edge of thought. When he finally turned the boat toward shore, the fog seemed thicker than before, almost as if reluctant to let him leave. The motor hummed quietly, a steady counterpoint to the silence of the sea, but every few minutes he glanced back at the tarp. It had not moved, yet he could not shake the feeling that it was watching, even wrapped and still. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, knuckles pale against the wood. The coastline emerged slowly, the outline of the harbor barely visible until he was nearly upon it. The familiar docks came into view, the small cluster of boats tied neatly, the weathered buildings beyond. Normally, the return to shore was a relief, a sign of work done, and another day provided for. But this morning, as the fisherman eased the boat into its berth, he felt something else, an unease that clung to him as firmly as the salt on his coat. He tied the ropes and shut off the motor, the harbor settling into silence once more. The fog drifted lazily between pilings, and the faint cry of gulls returned, sharper now, circling above as though drawn by something they did not understand. He looked once more at the bundle on the deck. The tarp had grown damp where the fish's body touched it, and faint streaks of color bled through, shimmering faintly even in the dim light. He knew he could not simply leave it. Something had been carried in from the sea that did not belong, and whether it was a gift or a warning, he could no longer tell. The fisherman placed his hand on the rough wood of the rail, steadying himself against a tremor he could not explain. In all his years on the water, the sea had provided strange things, but nothing like this. As the fog thinned slightly and the village stirred awake beyond the docks, he realized that whatever he had pulled from the depths was already beginning to draw eyes. Not just his own, but those of others who would soon ask questions he could not answer. The first to notice was a harbor master, who came down the dock with his ledger tucked beneath one arm and his cap pulled low against the damp. He paused by the fisherman's boat, eyes narrowing at the tarp shape resting on the planks. The fisherman said nothing, but the way he stood, shoulders tight and hands shoved into his coat pockets, drew more curiosity than explanation. Within minutes, word carried along the waterfront as quickly as smoke on wind. One by one, neighbors drifted toward the slip, fishermen with their own nets half mended, women with baskets of laundry, children who should have been in school but lingered for the promise of something unusual. They gathered at a cautious distance, speaking in voices lowered by instinct. The fog made every sound seem nearer, and no one wished to draw attention more than necessary. Someone asked if it was a shark, another suggested a sturgeon, but the fisherman's silence gave no confirmation. He had not unwrapped the tarp, and yet the damp cloth betrayed the secret it tried to contain. Iridescent colors bled faintly through, catching light in unnatural ways, like oil slicks on water. The harbor master scratched his chin, muttering about things better left at sea. The old widow who sold smoked herring at the market was the first to speak of bad luck. She leaned heavily on her cane, peering with clouded eyes, and declared that such fish had been seen before in her grandfather's day, always before storms or sickness. Her words carried weight, not because anyone believed her entirely, but because her voice trembled with conviction. The younger fishermen shifted uneasily, casting sidelong glances at the boat. One of them spat into the water for good measure, an old habit against ill fortune. Not all were fearful. A few men argued loudly that it should be cooked before it spoiled. Fish was fish, they said, and it made no sense to let meat rot when bellies went empty in lean times. One man offered to take it off the fisherman's hands, promising he would salt it down and make good use of it. Another laughed nervously, saying a stew would chase away whatever nonsense people thought they saw. But each time the tarp shifted slightly with the roll of the boat, their voices faltered, as though none wished to be the one to lift the covering first. Children pressed closer, their curiosity sharper than their parents' caution. They whispered about glowing scales and glassy eyes, building the mystery higher with each guess. One boy swore he saw the tarp pulse, though none believed him enough to lean closer and check. Mothers pulled their little ones back by their collars, whispering warnings of their own, stories passed down about things from the deep that should never be touched. The fisherman listened without answering. His weathered face gave away nothing, though inside he felt the weight of every word. He had spent his life among these people, known their voices and their ways, yet now he stood apart, keeper of something that drew more fear than wonder. He thought of the widow's warning, of storms and sickness, and wondered if bringing the fish ashore had already set something in motion. The dock grew crowded, the murmurs folding over one another until the air seemed thick with speculation. Some crossed themselves quietly, others muttered prayers into their beards. A few, bolder than the rest, leaned closer to the fisherman and urged him again to cook it, to prove it was nothing more than flesh and bone. Yet even they would not lift the tarp themselves. Responsibility clung to him alone, as though by catching the creature he had invited the burden of deciding its fate. By midday the tavern keeper had left his counter to see what the fuss was about, and the schoolteacher arrived late to her lessons after pausing at the dock. Sailors from neighboring harbors drifted in on the rumor, bringing stories of their own about strange lights seen offshore, about fish that sang or sank boats when touched. Each tale grew wilder, yet all fed into the same unease that hung over the crowd. The fisherman finally stepped forward, resting one hand on the rail of his boat. His voice was low when he spoke, but in the hush it carried clearly. He said only that the fish would not be eaten, not today. Some groaned in frustration, others sighed in relief, but no one pressed him further. The decision, for now, seemed to quiet the crowd, though the whispers did not fade. They followed him as he left the dock, carrying with him both the weight of the catch and the eyes of an entire village that no longer looked at him as they had before dawn. By evening, stories had already spread beyond the harbor. At the baker's stall, customers repeated that a cursed fish had been dragged from the water. At the tavern, mugs clinked over speculation that the government would arrive to claim it. At home, families told children to stay clear of the fisherman's boat, and shutters were drawn tighter than usual against the night. The sea had given something unfamiliar, and the village could not decide whether it was gift, omen, or warning. The whispers clung to every corner of town, growing louder in their secrecy, while the fishermen sat alone, listening to the silence that seemed to echo louder than all their voices combined. The harbor had grown quieter by the time the officials arrived. The morning's crowd had thinned, though not entirely disappeared, leaving behind clusters of villagers who lingered at corners or leaned against posts, waiting to see what would happen next. A pair of vehicles rolled up the narrow road that led to the dock, their tires crunching over gravel. From a first stepped the constable, his uniform neat but worn, the brim of his cap catching the fog. Behind him came two men in heavier coats, carrying cases that looked out of place in a fishing town. The fisherman stood beside his boat, shoulders squared though his eyes betrayed the weariness of the day already pressing on him. The officials climbed down onto the dock, their boots heavy against the planks. The constable spoke first, polite, but edged with the authority of someone who needed to keep order. He asked to see the catch, his tone making it less a request than an expectation. The fisherman hesitated, then untied the ropes holding the tarp in place. With a slow motion, he pulled the covering back, revealing what lay beneath. The fish's body gleamed even in the dim light, its scales throwing off colors that shifted as though the skin contained its own source of light. Patches of translucence revealed layers beneath, veins or filaments that pulsed faintly, though the creature had long ceased to move. Its eyes were still clear, too clear, glass-like and unblinking. The officials leaned in close, their expressions tightening but revealing little. One of the men knelt, adjusting his glasses as he studied the fins, tracing the edges without daring to touch them. The other pulled out a camera, the mechanical click of the shutter sounding loud in the silence. Photographs were taken from every angle. The lens hovered above the eyes, over the ridged mouth, along the gleaming length of its body. Notes were scribbled quickly into a small book, measurements called out in clipped voices. Each time the camera flashed, the gathered villagers shifted uneasily, as though the act of recording something so unnatural made it more real. The fisherman watched from the side, his arms folded across his chest, resisting the urge to intervene. It was his boat, his catch, yet already it felt like it belonged less to him and more to the men in coats. The constable asked a few questions. When it was caught, how deep the nets had been set, whether the fisherman had seen anything unusual in the water before. The answers were simple, delivered in the steady tone a man used to the sea's unpredictability. Nothing about the morning had suggested what the net would hold. Nothing except the sudden heaviness, the strange resistance as though the ocean had not wished to release what it carried. The men with the cases exchanged quiet words, too low for the fisherman to catch. They unpacked tools, small metallic instruments, and lifted samples from the fish's flesh with gloved hands. Even through the gloves, their movements were cautious, deliberate, as though they feared what might happen if they pressed too hard. The translucent tissue yielded strangely, parting with an ease that did not seem natural, and the fragments they collected shimmered faintly before being sealed away in vials. The villagers drew closer, but the constable held up a hand, keeping them at bay. The crowd muttered, their voices carrying the same mix of fear and fascination that had hung over the dock all day. Some demanded to know what it was. Others asked if it was safe. The officials offered no answers. Their faces betrayed nothing but concentration, their words clipped and procedural, as if naming the thing aloud might give it more power than they wished to grant. When the examination ended, The fish was once again covered, the tarp drawn tightly over its form. The officials packed their cases with care, sealing the samples as though they were carrying something volatile. One of them assured the constable that the materials would be sent for further analysis. No conclusion was offered, no classification, no comfort, only the vague assurance that experts elsewhere might know more. The fisherman remained still, his eyes fixed on the covered body on his deck. He had expected answers, even if they were uncertain. Instead, he was left with silence and the knowledge that what it pulled from the sea remained as much a mystery to those who studied it as it had been when it first thudded onto his planks. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers rising once more as they drifted back toward their homes and shops. The constable lingered only long enough to remind the fisherman that the authorities would be in touch, then followed the others back up the dock. Left alone, the fisherman tied the ropes more tightly around the tarp, though the gesture did little to settle his unease. The light had begun to fade from the sky, but the colors beneath the covering still seemed to flicker faintly, as though the creature refused to surrender to the ordinary silence of death. He stood there for a long time, the damp boards creaking beneath his boots, aware that though the officials had come and gone, the weight of the catch remained his to bear. The next morning broke no clearer than the last. The fog still clung to the harbor, dampening sound and shadowing the outlines of boats tied along the piers. The fisherman had returned early, unable to rest after a night spent hearing the faint creak of boards and imagining the covered body on his deck shifting when it should have been still. Word had already traveled farther than he intended. By the time he tied off his boat, a new group had appeared on the dock, their presence too deliberate to be mistaken for curious villagers. A small van with university markings was parked on the gravel road above, its rear doors left open to reveal cases and metallic instruments. 3 figures descended, carrying equipment with the focus of those who knew their time mattered. They were marine biologists, their coats damp from the mist, clipboards tucked under their arms, cases clutched tightly in gloved hands. The constable trailed behind them, his cap pulled low, as if his authority had been borrowed to grant the scientists passage. The fisherman stood silently by his boat, watching them approach, his face unreadable but his jaw set. When the tarp was pulled back again, the scientists froze. For a moment none of them spoke, only stared. The glow from the creature's scales had dulled slightly in the hours since it was first brought ashore, but the shifting colors still caught the gray light in ways that made the fish appear alive. The biologists exchanged glances, their lips tightening, eyes sharpening, their silence telling more than words could. One bent closer, a small light in hand, and traced the outline of the translucent flesh without touching it. Another began scribbling quickly into a notebook, his pen scratching in short, nervous bursts. The third unfolded measuring instruments, his movements precise yet hesitant, as though handling a thing that might react. They whispered among themselves, voices kept just low enough to exclude those watching from the pier. Words slipped out here and there, fragments of scientific terms, muttered references to deep-sea environments, genetic anomalies, things rarely heard in a fishing town. The constable leaned closer, straining to catch more, but the scientists avoided his eyes, their conversations kept within their small circle. They seemed both fascinated and unsettled, drawn toward the fish, yet wary of naming what it might mean. Rulers and calipers were set against his body, numbers spoken quietly and recorded in careful script. Photographs were taken again, this time with brighter lamps that cut through the fog, each flash reflecting off the creature's eyes until it seemed they shone with their own light. One of the biologists adjusted the fish's jaw with gloved hands, revealing the strange ridged plates within, not quite teeth, not quite bone. Another scraped a faint sample of the translucent tissue, sealing it in a vial that he immediately tucked into a padded container. Every action was deliberate, every movement slow, as though the body before them carried not just scientific interest, but a danger unspoken. The fisherman remained at the stern, his hands gripping the railing, eyes fixed on the faces of the visitors rather than the creature itself. He could read in their expressions what their mouths refused to say. Surprise, yes, but also recognition of something that should not be. They did not marvel as children at a curiosity. They measured as men confronted with the disruption of what they thought they knew. That silence weighed on him more heavily than the net had when he first pulled it from the water. As the minutes dragged on, The villagers began to gather once more at the edges of the dock. They did not press close as they had the day before. The mood had shifted. The presence of scientists, their instruments, their guarded tones, had made the catch seem less like a story and more like a problem. Mothers kept their children back, and older fishermen shook their heads, muttering that no good ever came of drawing scholars to the sea. The air thickened with unease, each whisper reinforcing the sense that something had arrived in their village that belonged elsewhere. When the examination seemed complete, the scientists conferred briefly, heads bent close, their words still shielded. Then one of them turned to the constable, speaking only to him in a tone low and clipped. The fisherman caught nothing of what was said, only saw the constable's jaw tighten as he nodded once. The scientists packed their instruments quickly, sealing vials, folding rulers, securing cameras. Before the tarp was drawn back over the fish, one of them paused, staring at its eyes a moment longer. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He pulled the cover tight, and the colors disappeared beneath heavy canvas. The van doors shut with a hollow sound, equipment cases stacked neatly inside. The three men climbed in, their coats damp, their notebooks thick with scribbled records. The constable lingered by the fisherman, offering no explanation, only the hollow assurance that more would be said in time. Then he followed the van up the gravel road, leaving the dock quiet once more. The fisherman remained by his boat, watching the fog swallow the departing vehicle. His catch lay beneath the tarp, unchanged yet altered in the eyes of all who had seen it. The silence of scientists spoke louder than any answer they might have given, and it left him with a heaviness he could not set down. The sea had delivered something beyond the reach of nets and hooks, and now it seemed the world beyond the harbor was stirring, drawn to what lay hidden beneath the canvas on his deck. The fog had not lifted when the van returned. It rolled back into the harbor without warning. The same three men stepping out, this time joined by another in a darker coat, who carried nothing but folder pressed flat against his chest. They did not move with the casual rhythm of men arriving for study. Their pace was quicker, their faces drawn tight, and the few villagers lingering on the dock stepped aside instinctively, sensing the shift before a word was spoken. The fisherman stood by his boat, shoulders squared as though bracing against a storm. He knew from their eyes that they had not come for more measurements. One of them, the eldest of the group, approached him directly. His voice was calm, yet the words carried an edge that cut through the damp air. He told the fisherman not to eat the fish. No hesitation, no attempt at persuasion. The words were instruction, as plain as if he had been ordering a man away from fire. The fisherman frowned but did not reply at once. The villagers who stood nearby stiffened at the command, glancing toward one another with unease. The scientist repeated himself, slower this time, as though making sure there could be no mistake. The fisherman asked why. His voice was steady, though he felt a tremor beneath his ribs that he would never show. The answers he received were not explanations, but warnings layered with half-formed possibilities. Contamination, one man said, his tone clipped. Mutation, whispered another, as if the word itself carried risk. The stranger in the dark coat broke his silence only to add something older, his words low enough that they seemed meant more for the air than for the ears that caught them. None of them elaborated. No one spoke of how such a thing could come to be, or why it had surfaced in his nets on a morning like any other. Their urgency lay not in teaching him, but in preventing him from acting. Do not eat it. Do not feed it to animals. Do not cut it further. Their voices overlapped, pressing the rules upon him with the weight of necessity. The fisherman felt his jaw clench. He had lived by the sea all his life, taken what it offered, and now stood accused of a danger he could neither see nor understand. The villagers shifted closer, their curiosity breaking against their caution. Some muttered that fish was fish and nothing more, that the sea had always provided strange catches, and men had always made meals of them. But the tone of the scientist quieted even the boldest voices. One of them, his hands still gloved from the morning before, spoke with a firmness that left no space for laughter. He said that to eat such a creature would be to invite harm, though he would not describe the shape of that harm. The fisherman caught the way his eyes darted to the tarp as he spoke, unwilling to meet his gaze. The stranger with the folder stepped closer then, his coat brushing damp against the planks. He leaned in and lowered his voice, Speaking words meant only for the fishermen, though those near strained to hear. He said there were things in the ocean that lived in layers deeper than light, things that should never reach the surface, and when they did, it was not for men to treat them as food. His words carried the tone of certainty, not knowledge. The fishermen felt the meaning sink heavier than the fog itself. When they were finished, the scientists offered no paperwork, no receipts, only more warnings repeated until they seemed less like instructions and more like ritual. Then they left as quickly as they had come, their van disappearing once more into the gray, leaving behind silence that felt denser than before. The villagers remained, their whispers sharper now, stories already forming out of fragments they had heard. Contamination became poison. Mutation turned into curse. Something older grew into legend by the time the first lanterns were lit along the shore. The fisherman stayed beside his boat long after the crowd thinned. The tarp still covered the body of the fish, ropes pulled tight, but now he looked at it differently. The warnings echoed in his mind, not because he trusted them, but because the urgency had carried a weight that even he could not ignore. He wondered if he would ever be told the truth, or if silence and fear were all the answers the world was prepared to give him. The sea had sent him something strange, and now men from beyond his village had come to take its meaning away. Yet still it lay on his deck, his responsibility, his burden, his mystery. He placed his hand on the damp wood of the rail and listened to gulls circling overhead, their cries sharp, as though they too sensed something in the air that did not belong. The days that followed brought more visitors to the harbor, their arrival breaking the quiet rhythm of the town. Vans unloaded crates of equipment, and men and women in thick coats carried clipboards, cameras, and metal cases. They moved with the kind of practiced precision that marked them as people used to investigation, not fishing. The fishermen watched them set up tables near the dock, unfurling wires and lamps, their voices clipped and low. The fish remained wrapped on his boat, its presence drawing all eyes. He felt it less like a catch and more like a stone in his chest, heavy, unavoidable. When the tarp was removed again, the reactions were the same as before. Sharp intakes of breath, the uneasy silence of people confronted with something they could not place. This time, though words followed, one researcher, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, spoke carefully, saying no species like this should exist in these waters. He listed the kinds of fish native to the coast, from cod to haddock to the deeper dwelling species, known only by trawlers. None bore even a trace of resemblance to what lay before them. Another scientist pointed out details of the creature's structure, the armor-like plates that covered its body, the translucent flesh threaded with faint lines that looked more like channels and veins, the strange ridge plates in its mouth. These were not the features of anything that belonged in the Atlantic's upper depths. They compared to known records, flipping through thick reference guides, pulling images on screens propped awkwardly on the dock. One muttered that the body suggested ancient forms, fish that had vanished from the fossil record millions of years ago. Coelacanth were mentioned, once thought extinct until a specimen surfaced in the 20th century, though even that comparison faltered. The scales here were different, sharper, more iridescent, and the shape of the jaw bore no kinship with anything catalogued. Another voice spoke of armored placoderms, relics of time when seas carried monsters, but the dates did not fit. This was not a fossil pulled from stone. It was flesh intact, fresh, and lying on the planks of a fisherman's boat. Samples were taken again, carefully, sealed in vials and marked with codes. One researcher murmured that even the tissue resisted categorization. Under the lens, cells did not behave as expected. Some split strangely, others seemed preserved as if untouched by decay. The fisherman caught fragments of their conversations, but never full explanations. He knew only that each word made the gulf between him, and what he had caught grow wider. This was not food, not fortune, but something that sat uneasily outside of every rule he understood. At night, the scientists stayed in the village inn, their voices carrying through thin walls. The fishermen, passing by once, heard enough to know they were comparing notes with museums in distant cities. Archives were checked, specimens brought to mind, yet none matched. One man muttered that even the rarest collections, jars sealed a century ago, faded sketches and brittle books, held nothing that resembled a fish now wrapped in damp canvas by the harbor. The fishermen did not linger to hear more. The sound of their restless debate unsettled him more than silence would have. The villagers grew restless as well. Each new day that the body remained on the boat stretched their patience thinner. Some whispered that the scientists should take it away, lock it in a university vault where it belonged. Others spoke of omens again, dredging up stories their grandparents had told them, of storms that followed strange catches, of illness that came to those who handled fish that did not belong. Children who once had crept near now avoided the dock, dragged away by parents who muttered prayers as they passed. The fisherman kept his distance from the scientists, though they returned again and again to him with their questions. They wanted to know the exact depth of his nets, the coordinates of the catch, the condition of the sea. He gave his answers plainly, without embellishment. The water had been as it always was. The fog had rolled in as it always did. Nothing in the sea had prepared him for what he pulled aboard. Their pens scratched his words onto paper, but their eyes told him they found no comfort in them. One evening, as the lamps on the dock burned low and the last notes were packed into folders, a young researcher stayed behind. She lingered near the boat, her breath forming clouds in the cool air. She stared at the covered body and spoke quietly, almost to herself, that if the creature was what it seemed, then they were standing in the presence of something the world was not meant to see alive. She did not explain further. When she left, her words hung in the fisherman's mind like the mist itself, heavy, impossible to shake. The fish remained there, silent, its form refusing decay, its strangeness untouched by the passing of days. The scientist's conclusion echoed the fisherman's own unspoken thought. It was a thing out of place, not just in the water where it had been caught, but in time itself. The fish lay beneath the tarp, but its presence was never still, even wrapped in heavy canvas. It seemed to press outward, as if the cloth could not quite contain what it covered. Each time the scientists returned, they approached it with the kind of caution normally reserved for things alive, though it had not moved since the moment it thudded onto the fisherman's deck. The fishermen noticed this change in them. At first, they had handled it as a specimen, measuring, sampling, photographing. Now they treated it differently, as though the longer it remained, the less it resembled something that could be explained. Its eyes were the first thing that drew comment. Days had passed, yet the glass-like orbs had not dulled. They were as clear as the morning they had been pulled from the water, reflecting the gray of the sky and the shifting figures who leaned too close. Fish eyes cloud quickly, turning opaque within hours, but these remained sharp, the pupils contracting faintly in the lamplight as though responding to changes no one could account for. The villagers who dared to glimpse them swore the eyes watched, not blankly, but with a strange alertness. Mothers pulled their children back when they whispered such things, but the word spread all the same. The flesh resisted decay in ways that unsettled even the most clinical observers. When samples were removed, they did not spoil. Sealed in vials, the tissue remained moist, almost vibrant, long after it should have broken down. The fisherman overheard one scientist say that under the microscope, the cells looked stubborn, as if frozen in a state between death and life. They did not collapse, did not dry, did not rot. Another spoke of faint chemical activity, whispers of energy where there should have been none. Their voices carried unease. They recorded the data, but the more they wrote, the more uncertain their hands seemed. On the dock, they set up instruments to measure, machines that hummed and blinked with colored lights. Probes pressed to the fish's body registered faint pulses. Not heartbeats exactly, but rhythmic signals that suggested something within still moved. The patterns were irregular yet persistent, sparking across monitors in waves. Some dismissed it as interference, background noise from the harbor's electrical lines, but when the devices were tested elsewhere, the readings vanished. Only when the probes touched the fish did the signals return. At night, under the dim lanterns that cast long shadows across the water, the fishermen saw the scientists gather in hushed clusters. They argued in tones too low to carry clearly, though words like anomaly and impossible reached them across the damp air. One of them, younger than the rest, looked pale as he packed away his instruments, muttering that they should never have let it leave the sea. Another clapped him sharply on the shoulder, silencing him before he said more. The fishermen slept poorly those nights, waking to every creak of the boards as though the boat itself bore a weight too heavy to carry. Once, near dawn, he swore he saw light seeping faintly from the seams of the tarp, a glow that pulsed in time with the rhythm of the tide. He did not lift the cover to confirm it. Instead, he turned away, gripping the railing until the cold of the metal steadied him. The villagers noticed changes too. Gulls circled the harbor in restless patterns, never landing on the fisherman's boat. Cats that prowled the alleys avoided the dock entirely, arching their backs when brought near. Dogs pulled against their leashes, whining, refusing to approach. The widow who had first spoken of omens declared the town cursed until the creature was gone, her voice rising louder with each passing day. Still, no one dared touch it but the fishermen and the scientists, and even they did so as though brushing the edge of a flame. The fish had not moved, not breathed, not lived, yet in its stillness, it disturbed more deeply than if it had thrashed on the deck. The fisherman stood often by its side, staring at the covered mass, remembering the way his net had strained as though reluctant to yield. Now he wondered if the sea had resisted not to protect him, but to protect itself. Whatever this was, it had not belonged on the surface. And yet here it remained, eyes clear, flesh unspoiled, instruments whispering faint pulses from a body that should have been silent. By the end of the week, the atmosphere around the harbor had shifted from unease to something heavier, like a curtain drawn too tightly across a stage. The villagers still lingered at the edges, whispering, but their curiosity was no longer the main current. What filled the air now was control, the kind that came with men in coats and boxes of equipment, with rules spoken sharply and written in notebooks thick with codes. The fishermen watched as the scientists arrived one morning with a new contraption, a container taller than a man, fitted with thick seals and humming faintly as it was wheeled down the dock. The container looked out of place among the salt-stained planks and weathered boats. Its metal sides were smooth, its corners reinforced, and when the door swung open, a rush of chilled air escaped, curling like smoke into fog. They explained little, only muttered phrases about preservation, stability, containment. The fisherman heard the words, but felt none of them were meant to reassure him. Instead, they carried the same urgency as their warnings before, an insistence that this was no longer a catch to be weighed or sold, but something that demanded restraint, as if it could do harm, even in death. With deliberate motions, they uncovered the fish once more. The colors along its body had not faded. If anything, they glowed more vividly under morning light, as though the days above water had awakened something that should have remained deep. The scientists avoided meeting each other's eyes as they lifted it, their gloves thick, their movements cautious. Even with several men straining at the weight, the body seemed resistant, its slick surface shifting oddly against their grip, as though reluctant to be moved. The fisherman instinctively reached out, steadying the tail as they maneuvered it across the dock. No one asked him to help, yet his hands were there, as if reminding both them and himself that the creature had been his to claim. When the fish slid into the container, the sound was a heavy thud, softened by the hiss of cold air. The scientists worked quickly, strapping it down with wide bands that locked into place with metallic snaps. Instruments were checked, readouts studied, dials adjusted until the numbers fell into ranges only they seemed to understand. One of them scribbled red marks in the corner of his notebook, and another fixed a warning label onto the steel exterior. The words were stark and simple: "Do not open without authorization." The fisherman stood back, his jaw tight. He realized then how completely the fish had been taken from him. In the water, it had been his burden to haul. On the deck, it had been his mystery to guard. Now, locked inside a humming container, it belonged to others, reduced to a specimen that would be carted away, its secrets pried open in labs far from the sea that had carried it. He felt something hollow stir in his chest, as though a line had been cut without warning. Ownership slipped away not in an instant, but in the slow, inevitable tightening of rules and ropes. Around them, villagers whispered again, though their voices carried less curiosity now and more fear. The sight of the container unsettled them. It was too clean, too deliberate, like a vault built to hold something forbidden. A child asked his mother why a dead fish needed guarding, and she hushed him quickly, her eyes darting toward the men in coats. The fisherman heard the question linger in the air long after. When the scientist sealed the door and the hum of the machine deepened, the fisherman felt the loss fully. He could no longer see the strange shimmer of scales or the clear, unnerving eyes, only the cold steel that now claimed him. One of the men approached him, thanking him formally for his cooperation, though the words sounded more like a dismissal than gratitude. The fisherman nodded, but his eyes lingered on the container, his hands tightening into fists inside the pockets of his coat. As the scientists prepared to move the unit, guards were placed beside it, men who did not carry notebooks or measuring tools, but who stood watch with folded arms and sharp eyes. The message was clear without being spoken. This was no longer a matter of curiosity but of control, a thing to be guarded as if it were both treasure and threat. The fisherman turned away, staring out at the water. The sea rolled on as it always had, gray and indifferent, the fog stretching thin across its surface. He wondered if the ocean felt the absence, if it noticed what had been taken from it. He thought of the net straining in his hands, of the moment when the fish had broken the surface, glowing against the dawn. For a fleeting instant, it had been a part of his life's rhythm on the water. Now, locked away in a container colder than the sea itself, it belonged to no one, or perhaps to everyone who feared it. The dock settled back into silence once the container was secured, but the fisherman knew the harbor would never feel the same again. Something had been carried out of the depths and placed into human hands. And with it came a weight he could not name, a sense that whatever the sea had given him, it had not meant for him to keep. The container did not remain unnoticed for long. Within days, new vehicles began appearing at the edge of the harbor, not the marked vans of the university team, but unmarked ones, their paint dull, their plates plain. They arrived early before the shops opened, before the market stalls were set out, when the streets were still wet with night mist. Men stepped out of them in plain clothes that seemed too deliberate in their simplicity. Coats buttoned to neck, shoes polished though streaked quickly with salt. They moved with a heaviness that set them apart from the townsfolk, carrying no crates or tools at first, only presence. The villagers watched from doorways and windows as these men walked down the dock, their eyes sweeping across boats, nets, and faces with the same searching intensity. The fisherman was already there, as he always was, standing near the container that hummed steadily with its unseen burden. The men did not ask permission. They opened cases lined with padded interiors, instruments more advanced than the university team had carried, and began setting them up with an efficiency that brooked no interruption. One of them introduced himself in little more than a murmur, flashing credentials too quickly for anyone to read. The fisherman caught only the weight of the gesture, not the name. The questions came soon after, precise and pointed, directed at him alone. Where exactly had he cast his nets? At what time? What were the weather conditions, the depth, the coordinates? Did he notice any unusual currents, any disruptions in the water, any lights? Each answer he gave was scribbled down in a notebook that closed as soon as it opened, leaving him with the sense that his words mattered less than the act of recording them. Samples were taken not only from the fish but from the dock itself, from the water lapping against the pilings, from the net still drying in the cold air. Swabs brushed against the wood of his boat, against ropes and tarps, as though contamination could spread outward from the creature that now lay locked away. They sealed everything in tight containers, marked only with numbers, their hands moving quickly, but without the curiosity the scientists had shown. This was not study. It was containment, a closing in of lines around something they did not intend to let go. The fisherman stood back, arms folded, feeling the tide of ownership recede completely. What had begun as his catch, hauled heavy and gleaming from the fog, had first been taken by scientists, then sealed in machines, and now drawn into the orbit of men who carried the weight of government without ever naming it. They did not ask him how he felt or what he believed. They asked only for facts, stripped bare, and when he gave them, they nodded once and moved on. Villagers kept their distance, their whispers sharper now, broken by sudden silences whenever one of the plainclothed men passed too near. Children were pulled back into houses, doors shut earlier than usual. The presence of the vans and their passengers seemed to drain the harbor of its ordinary rhythm. Even the gulls seemed to circle higher, wary of the figures who treated the dock not as a workplace but as a site to be secured. At intervals, one of the men would lift the container's heavy latch and open the sealed door just wide enough to insert instruments. The fishermen caught glimpses of frost curling out, the cold air mixing with the damp of the fog. They took readings quickly, shutting it again before too much was seen. Their faces gave nothing away, though he noticed the way their hands lingered a moment longer on the lock, as if reassuring themselves it was firmly closed. When they spoke among themselves, it was in tones too low to carry, though he caught fragments that unsettled him more than silence would have. Phrases like elevated markers and nonconforming data passed through the air before being swallowed by the sound of the humming container. He realized then that they were not here to marvel, not even understand. They were here to control, to keep it within lines that no one else could cross. By evening, the vans were gone again, leaving only the faint impression of their tires in the gravel and the memory of sharp eyes scanning every corner of the harbor. The fisherman sat alone on his boat, staring at the container that had once held his catch. It no longer felt like anything he had touched or hauled. It belonged to others now, to men who did not answer questions, who came and went without explanation. He thought of the net straining in his hands, of the shimmer breaking the surface, and of how quickly it had been taken from him. What had once been his mystery was now theirs, locked behind cold steel and guarded by silence heavier than the sea itself. The fisherman had grown tired of silence. Each day, men in coats came and went, their vans rolling over the gravel and disappearing back into fog, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions and a dock that no longer felt his own. The container remained where they had placed it, humming quietly like a heart that refused to stop. And though the fisherman still stood watch, he felt himself more like a guard for others than the rightful keeper of what had been pulled from the sea. When the officials left, when the village quieted, he found himself walking inland toward the town hall, a place most fishermen visited only for licenses or disputes. The archives lay in the building's cellar, a long room that smelled of damp wood and ink faded by time. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the lantern he carried, its glow falling across shelves lined with ledgers, journals, and brittle maps. Few bothered with these records anymore, but the fisherman's hands were steady as he pulled volumes from their place, spreading them across the long wooden table. The bindings cracked under his touch, pages yellowed and curled at the edges, but the words still spoke, faint ink carrying echoes of men who had gone to sea long before him. It was not long before he found the first entry, a journal from the late 1700s. The script hurried and uneven, described a catch pulled from the waters off the same coast. The fisherman who wrote it had spoken of scales that gleamed with unnatural color, of eyes that did not dull even after days ashore. He had kept it hidden at first, intending to sell it in secret, but the weeks that followed brought fever to his household, and storms tore the harbor with a violence remembered in the margin notes of later hands. By the time the sickness had passed, the fish was gone, carted away by men from the city, leaving the family ruined and the village wary. Another record, older still, came from a maritime log dated to the 1600s. The entry was brief, written by a captain who described one of his men hauling in a creature from the old depths. It had scales that shimmered in strange hues, and though the crew argued whether it should be eaten, the captain ordered it thrown back into the sea. That same night, a storm rose sudden and fierce, scattering ships along the coast and sinking two before morning. The log ended with a note that the surviving crew swore the sea had been angered by the catch, its fury loose for daring to pull up what did not belong. The fisherman turned page after page, each account separated by decades but bound by familiarity. The details never aligned perfectly. Some spoke of creatures with armored scales, others of translucent flesh, but the patterns were undeniable. A strange catch, unnatural in appearance, a warning ignored or heeded too late, and always something that followed: storms, sickness, or disappearances. Families struck down by fevers no one else caught. Ships vanished without trace between one harbor and the next. Villages emptied suddenly after nights of violent weather. The words were there, scattered across centuries, each telling the same story in fragments too alike to dismiss. By the time he reached the last volume, his lantern had burned low. The final record he uncovered was from the early 1800s, written in a careful, measured hand. It described a fish taken near the very waters where his own nets had dragged. The writer noted its eyes, clearer than glass, and flesh that would not spoil. He wrote that villagers quarreled over it, some insisting it was an omen of fortune, others swearing it was a curse. Within weeks of its arrival, 3 boats failed to return from sea, their crews never found. The journal ended with a single line underlined twice: "What the deep holds, let it keep." The fisherman closed the book, his hands heavy. He sat in the silence of the archive, listening to the faint hiss of his lantern, the echo of warnings written by men long gone. It struck him that what he faced was not new. Others had stood where he stood now, holding in their nets something the sea did not wish to surrender. They had argued, debated, hidden, and feared, and in every case, the sea had answered with sickness or storm until the creature was gone. He replaced the journals carefully, his boots echoing on the cellar floor, as he climbed the stairs back toward the night. Outside, the fog had thickened once more, rolling inland like a tide. The lights of the harbor flickered faintly in the distance, and from where he stood, he could almost imagine the container humming beneath the mist, a pulse carried forward from centuries of warnings. The words in the journal clung to him as he walked home, as heavy as the net had been in his hands that first morning. What the deep holds, let it keep. The fisherman sat in his kitchen long after the lamps in the village had gone dark. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove, forgotten, its steam curling into the low rafters. He had not slept well for days, each night broken by the echo of voices, scientists urging restraint, villagers muttering about omens, government men pressing questions he had no way to answer. The harbor no longer belonged to him, nor the catch that had once been his. Locked inside its steel container, it was guarded, measured, catalogued, and studied. Yet even as they claimed it, he knew a piece remained with him, hidden away before the warnings began. On the morning he had first brought the fish ashore, before the scientists and officials crowded the dock, he had done what every fisherman did by instinct. He had cut a portion free, a small wedge of flesh from just behind the gills, and wrapped it tightly in oilcloth, planning to salt it down later. It was routine, a gesture of habit as natural as coiling rope or gutting the day's catch. At the time, the strange shimmer of the meat had seemed only another oddity in a life of oddities drawn from the sea. He had thought nothing of it. Now, that wrapped parcel sat at the back of his larder, untouched, waiting like a secret he could neither reveal nor discard. He rose from the table and opened the cupboard. His hand lingered on the wooden door, the cool draft from inside spilling across his skin. There was a small bundle, tied with twine, its edges darkened by damp. He lifted it carefully, feeling the faint weight in his palm. The cloth was still cold, though it had sat there for days without ice. He placed it on the table and sat again, staring at it as though it were an intruder. Fear pressed against him from one side, curiosity from the other. The warnings had been clear, though never explained. Contamination, mutation, something older. Each word had been spoken like a verdict, yet none had been defined. He thought of the scientists' pale faces, the way their instruments had twitched with unreadable signals. He thought of the journals in the town archive, the words left by men long dead, describing sickness and storms that followed strange catches. Every piece of knowledge pointed toward caution. And yet, the fisherman's life had been built on understanding the sea through touch, smell, taste. How could he turn away from knowing what he held? He untied the twine slowly, unwrapping the oilcloth with hands steady but unwilling. The flesh inside glistened faintly, its surface smooth and iridescent, as if it had just been pulled from the water. There was no smell of rot, no sharp tang of decay. Instead, the air carried only a faint metallic scent, like salt water mixed with iron. He prodded it gently with the tip of his knife, half expecting it to crumble or bleed, but it held firm, supple yet unyielding. In the dim light of the kitchen, the piece seemed almost a pulse, though he knew it must have been his own eyes tricking him. He rewrapped it quickly, the cloth tight, the knot pulled firm. He could not eat it, not yet, perhaps not ever, but neither could he bring himself to hand it over to the men who claimed the rest. This was his proof, his portion, the last piece of the catch that remained truly his. He slid the bundle into a small wooden box and tucked it deep beneath sacks of flour and salt, a place where only he would know to look. Sleep did not come that night. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to the faint creak of the house and the distant sound of waves brushing against the shore. His thoughts circled endlessly. What if the flesh carried sickness, as the records had warned? What if storms rose in answer to its presence? But another thought pressed just as heavily. What if it was more than flesh? What if it carried something the scientists would never understand, something worth knowing before it was lost to steel and secrecy? When dawn finally broke, The fisherman returned his boat as he always did. The officials were already at the dock, their questions sharp, their eyes searching. He answered them with calm brevity, his face betraying nothing. All the while, he carried the knowledge of what lay hidden at home, wrapped and waiting. The discovery was no longer his in the eyes of others, but in truth, it still was. A small portion, preserved in secrecy, left him caught between fear of what it might bring and the pull of curiosity that had guided every cast of his nets. The sea had given him something, and though others had claimed it, a part of it remained in his keeping, demanding a choice he had yet to make. The fisherman's house was quiet, but he felt the weight of the hidden bundle as though it breathed in the dark of his cupboard. He had tucked it away beneath sacks of flour and salt, a place meant to be ordinary, unremarkable. Yet from the moment he set it there, the house seemed changed. The air carried a faint tang of metal, sharp and restless, and no matter how tightly the oilcloth was wrapped, he felt as if the thing inside pressed outward, demanding notice. He told no one, not the men at the dock, not the curious neighbors who still linger for news, not even the constable who stopped him once with a question too carefully worded to be casual. He kept the secret close, though the days that followed proved it would not remain quiet. The first sign came from the cat, a gray animal that prowled the fisherman's yard, scavenging scraps and fish heads he often tossed its way. It had never feared the kitchen, but now it lingered only at the threshold, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the cupboard with a wariness that deepened each time it passed. One evening, when the fisherman tried to coax it inside with a bit of herring, it hissed, its back arched high, and fled across the yard, not returning for days. He watched it vanish into the fog and felt a chill he would not name. Dogs reacted no better. The neighbor's hound, usually eager to nose at anything that smelled of fish, refused even to enter the porch when the wrapped bundle lay hidden. It whined, tugged at its leash, and barked until the neighbor dragged it away. The fisherman said nothing, but he noticed the villagers beginning to glance at his house differently, as though the unease of their animals spoke louder than words. The second sign came from the salt. He discovered it one morning when he moved the sacks to reach the box where the bundle lay concealed. Grains near the cloth had clumped into damp crystals, their usual whiteness gone dull and gray. At first, he thought moisture had seeped in, but the further he examined, the more he saw the change spreading outward in irregular patches, as if the salt itself recoiled. The twine around the oilcloth had stiffened too, fibers rough and brittle, as though touched by something corrosive. He replaced everything carefully, tamping down the bags to hide the marks, though the sight lingered in his mind long after. Water proved no kinder. One night, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, he unwrapped the bundle just enough to expose a corner of the flesh. It glistened faintly in the lamplight, as though it had not touched the sea in days. He filled a tin cup with water from his well and poured it over the sample, watching as it trickled across the surface. The change was immediate. The clear water darkened, shifting to a faint green, then deepened to a cloudy gray. The metallic smell sharpened, filling the room, and the fisherman's stomach turned. He poured the liquid into the earth outside, where it sank quickly, leaving the soil damp with sheen that caught the moonlight unnaturally. By morning, the patch of ground remained bare. No grass, no moss, only a dark stain where the water had touched. He kept these things to himself. Each day, he returned to the dock, answering the officials' questions with the same measured calm, never betraying that a portion of the catch lay hidden in his cupboard at home. They asked if he had touched the fish, if he had handled it in ways not reported, if he had noticed anything strange. He shook his head and told them nothing of the animal's fear. The salt turned brittle, the water that refused to remain clean. At night, when the fog pressed against the windows and the hum of the container at the harbor reached him faintly through the stillness, he would sit at the table with the oilcloth bundle resting before him. It was a secret he could not discard. Though each passing day made its presence harder to bear, he wondered whether the sea had offered him this peace as a test or a curse, whether it had meant for him to hold it at all. The fisherman's hands were steady when they tied the cloth again, but in the silence of his kitchen, he felt a truth settle on him. Whatever lived in that flesh had not died with the body. It remained, patient and unyielding, waiting for something he could not yet name. At the university, the container was meant to be untouchable, It had been brought in under guard, rolled through corridors too narrow for something so large, its humming presence startling students who caught only glimpses of it before doors were shut behind. The building chosen for its keeping was a windowless annex, a place usually reserved for deep storage, locked archives, and experimental work few ever spoke about in public. There it remained sealed and cold, instruments wired to its frame, lights blinking across panels that reassured the men assigned to watch it that everything within was stable. Yet even behind steel and refrigeration, the fish carried unease, a quiet gravity that pressed on those who worked near it. For several days, technicians checked the readings twice daily. Temperature, pressure, chemical levels, all remained steady, though notes in the margins hinted at irregular pulses that no one could account for. Guards were posted at both entrances, plainclothes men who carried no insignia yet stood with the stillness of those used to orders. The scientists visited in small groups, their conversations clipped, their notebooks closed quickly when others drew near. They recorded data, collected samples from the air inside the chamber, and spoke occasionally of comparisons to records in other institutions. Then they left, and the container hummed on. It was a Monday morning when the first rumor began. A custodian claimed that the annex doors had been opened at an hour no one was scheduled to enter. He said he saw men moving crates into an unmarked truck, though none of the official logs recorded a transfer. By noon, whispers had already spread among the faculty. Some insisted the government had moved the specimen in secret, that it had been spirited away to another facility where fewer eyes could watch. Others believed the story too obvious, a cover for something stranger. The following day, another account surfaced. A laboratory assistant spoke of entering the chamber to find the container's seals intact, but the interior changed. The fish, once strapped and cold, was gone. In its place was only a thin layer of residue, dark and glistening, smeared across the straps as though the body had melted away in the night. Instruments still showed temperature within range, pressure unchanged, but the subject they measured no longer existed. She swore the smell inside the container was sharp, metallic, almost electrical, and that it lingered on her skin long after she had left the room. Her supervisors dismissed her account. Yet the story circulated in hushed tones, repeated with each telling until it was no longer just her voice but many. Soon the rumors diverged, each retelling twisting the mystery further. Some said the body had not decayed but disappeared, vanishing entirely as though it had never been placed there. Others said the residue had been collected in haste and stored elsewhere, though no one knew where. A few claimed the scientists themselves had destroyed it, fearing what it might reveal if left to be studied too long. The most unsettling whispers suggested the specimen had not been dead after all, that it had simply ceased to remain where it was held, slipping back into whatever place it had come from. The fishermen heard of these things secondhand, carried by traders and distant relatives who passed through the village with news from the city. Each version conflicted with the last, yet all agreed on one point. The container no longer held what it once had. His hands tightened when he heard it, for he knew what none of the others did, that a piece of flesh still lay hidden in his house, wrapped in oilcloth, stubbornly intact. While others argued whether the fish had been moved or decayed, he alone lived with the proof that neither seemed true. At the university, the annex was locked more tightly than before, though it now guarded absence. Officials refused to answer questions. Professors deflected inquiries, claiming research was ongoing but releasing no data. Students speculated in corridors, their theories ranging from classified projects to curses, each explanation more elaborate than the last. The container itself remained humming, cold, but useless, a shell without a body. Some said the steel walls still bore faint marks, impressions where the creature had pressed outward against its bonds, though no one could prove it. The truth of what happened that night in the annex never settled. The official records noted only a transfer, though no signatures followed the line. Those who had seen the residue were reassigned, their testimony softened with words like inconclusive and anomaly. And in the silence that followed, the fish became not just a specimen but a story, a shape that lived in memory without evidence, leaving behind questions heavier than its actual weight. Back in the village, the fisherman carried the news in silence. He tended his nets, answered questions with steady words. But at night, he returned to the cupboard, to the parcel wrapped in oilcloth that still gleamed when unwrapped. Whatever had vanished from the container, whatever residue or absence filled the annex, it had not been final. He knew this because the secret he kept resisted decay, resisted explanation, and remained as much a burden as the day he had pulled it from the sea. They came for him not long after the news of the missing container began to spread. It was late afternoon, the harbor dim beneath a sky thick with low clouds, when the fisherman noticed a pair of figures moving down the dock with unusual purpose. They were not strangers. He recognized two of the scientists who had first examined the fish on his boat, their coats damp from the mist, their eyes sharper than before. This time there was no camera, no ruler, no notebook balanced against a knee. They carried only themselves, their urgency apparent even from a distance. The fisherman stood by his boat, tying lines he had already secured when they approached. Their steps were quick, their voices low but firm. They asked if they might speak with him in private, away from the curious eyes of the villagers who still loitered by the tavern doors and fish stalls. He nodded once, leading them along the pier with a fog pressed close, muffling the sounds of gulls and creaking boards. There, without preamble, they told him what they suspected. A portion of the fish was missing, a sample not accounted for. They had checked their records, compared every note, and still, something was unspoken in the numbers. They looked at him hard, their silence a question more pointed than words. The fisherman did not answer. His face remained as weathered and unreadable as the planks beneath their feet, though his heart tightened. He had hidden the flesh carefully, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away where only his hands had reached. Still, the intensity of their gaze told him they already knew. He felt the weight of the secret in his chest, the small piece of sea's burden that lingered in his cupboard like a stone. The younger of the two leaned closer then, his voice unsteady in its urgency. "Do not eat it," he said. The word struck with the force of command, more plea than advice. The other joined quickly, his tone heavier, his eyes darting as though the fog itself might overhear. "Do not burn it. Do not bury it in the sea." Each sentence carried the rhythm of a ritual, spoken with precision, as though rehearsed. The fisherman frowned, asking what harm could come from it. Their reply was silence first, then words too fragmented to soothe. They spoke of reactions not recorded in any chart, of residue left where the fish had been stored, of signals measured by machines that could not be explained. They admitted that the body had vanished from the container, leaving only traces they could not classify. Whatever it was, they said, it resisted destruction. The fisherman listened, his arms folded, his breath slow and steady though unease coiled inside him. Their warning pressed heavier than the first. Back then they had spoken of contamination, a mutation, of vague dangers that seemed distant. Now their voices carried no distance. They feared what remained, feared what a single careless act might release. One of them, the elder, said he'd seen salt corrode in its presence, water darkened with unnatural hues. The fisherman felt a cold recognition stir in him, for he had seen the same. Yet he gave no sign, offering them no confirmation. They pressed again, their eyes pleading now, "Do not eat it. Do not burn it. Do not bury it in the sea." The repetition rang like a chant, heavy with implication. They seemed less like scientists then, and more like messengers bound by rules they barely understood themselves. They gave no solution, no instruction on what to do if he had such a piece, only the strict outline of what must not be done. When he asked what remained, what choice was left, they looked at him with something close to despair. One said only that some things must endure untouched, that interference would invite outcomes no one could predict. When they left, the fog swallowed them quickly, their footsteps fading along the dock. The fisherman remained where he was, staring at the gray water. Their words echoed in his mind, sharper than gull cries, sharper than the creak of rope against wood. He thought of the oilcloth bundle, of the salt that turned brittle around it, of the water that darkened when it touched the flesh. He thought of the animals that refused to near his door, and of the journals in the archive that spoke of storms and sickness. The warning had not been given to calm him. It had been given because they feared what even they could not explain. That night, alone in his kitchen, the fisherman laid the bundle on the table. He untied the twine, just enough to glimpse the faint shimmer within. The flesh still gleamed as if drawn fresh from the sea, its surface untouched by time. He wrapped it again quickly, his hand steady though his heart was not. Their voices lingered with him, their strange litany pressed into his thoughts like a weight he could not shake. Do not eat it. Do not burn it. Do not bury it in the sea. The lamp on the fisherman's table flickered. Its flame bowed low in the draft that crept through the seams of the old house. Outside, the sea moved in its steady rhythm, unseen but ever present. Its hiss against the rocks carried faintly through the fog. The fisherman sat in silence, his elbows resting on the scarred wood, his eyes fixed on the small bundle before him. The oilcloth was tied tight, darkened where damp had seeped through, but still it held its shape, the weight within undeniable. It had been days since he last unwrapped it, yet the thought of it had never left his mind. Now, alone in the quiet of his kitchen, he felt the burden more heavily than ever. He thought first of the voices, the scientists with their measured tones, the officials with their clipped questions, the younger man with his plea that bordered on desperation. Do not eat it. Do not burn it. Do not bury it in the sea. The words had followed him like shadows, spoken with an urgency that betrayed fear more than certainty. He wondered what they knew, what they had seen in their instruments and records, what had been whispered in meetings behind closed doors. Their warnings had been sharp but hollow, instructions without explanation, and in their absence he was left with nothing but doubt. Then he thought of the records, the journals he had read in the dim cellar, the uneven script of men who had come before him. They too had pulled strange things from the sea, and always misfortune had followed. Storms rising sudden, fever spreading, ships lost without return. Each account different in detail but alike in pattern, a rhythm carried across centuries. What the deep holds, let it keep. The words had been written by a hand long gone, yet they felt as close as his own. He had ignored them once, dismissing them as superstition. Now, with the bundle before him, they carried a weight he could no longer set aside. His eyes fell again on the oilcloth. He remembered the cat that hissed and fled, the dog that would not step onto porch. He remembered the salt corroded into dull clumps, the water turned green and gray, the soil stained where it spilled. He had seen with his own eyes what it could do, yet still he kept it. Curiosity, stubbornness, perhaps even pride. It had been his catch, hauled from the sea by his own net, and though others had claimed the body, this piece remained his. But now, with the night pressing close and the voices of warning circling his thoughts, he wondered if the weight of possession was worth the risk. He reached out and touched the cloth with the edge of his fingers. It was cold, as though the sea still clung to it, as though the depth it had come from had not let go. He thought of unwrapping it one final time, of cutting into the flesh and seeing what no one else had dared. He thought of fire, of reducing it to ash and scattering it where the wind could carry it beyond reach. He thought of the sea, of lowering it back into the water and watching it vanish beneath the waves, return to the silence it had been torn from. Each choice seemed both right and wrong, heavy with consequences he could not measure. The fisherman leaned back, the chair creaking under him. His gaze drifted to the window, where the fog pressed like a wall, obscuring the horizon. Somewhere beyond, ships moved, men fished, children played on the shore, all unaware of what rested in his kitchen. The world carried on, waiting unknowingly, untouched by the decision that weighed in his hands. He felt a strange isolation then, not just from his village, not just from the men who had studied and warned, but from the world itself. He alone carried this burden, and no one else would decide for him. The flame of the lamp steadied, its glow casting long shadows across the table. The fisherman closed his eyes briefly, listening to the faint hum of the sea in the distance. When he opened them, the bundle was still there, silent, patient, as if it too waited for his choice. He reached forward slowly, resting his hand on it, the cloth cool against his palm. Whatever he chose, whether to keep, to destroy, or to return, would be his alone. The warnings, the records, the fear, all had their place, but the decision belonged only to him. And as the night stretched on, the fisherman sat in silence, his hand upon the oilcloth, while the world beyond slept, unaware of the legacy that lay wrapped and waiting in his kitchen.